Today's speaker probably needs no introduction. I'm sure you're all familiar with Tom and his work, but I will give him a short introduction anyways. So Tom Lippmann is a nearshore oceanographer with affiliations in the Department of Earth Sciences and Ocean Engineering. He received a BA in Math and Biology from Linfield College and an MS and PhD in Oceanography at OSU. He's worked as a research oceanographer at Scripps and was then a research scientist at Ohio State University. And his current research is focused on shallow water oceanography, hydrography, and bathymetric evolution in coastal waters, spanning the intercontinental shelf, the surf zone, and inlet environments. So please join me in welcoming Tom.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate that. So today I want to talk about some progress that myself and my collaborators, Tracy, Diane, Mike, Dave, Elijah, and Jag have all been doing in the Hampton Seabrook Estuary. We're looking at biophysical drivers of sedimentation in salt marsh environments. So we'll talk a little bit about why we want to do that here in just a moment. This work is funded by the U.S. Coastal Research Program through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I want to give some special thanks to a few individuals, John Hunt in particular, and Frankie Sullivan, who spent a significant amount of time working with us. And also Savannah, Anna Marie, and Gabriel for helping us in the field and other analysis of some of the data. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Hampton Seabrook Estuary, just to orient everybody. This is a Google Earth image of the estuary, several kilometers wide, several kilometers long, and it is dominated by a marsh system, which is cut by tidal currents that enter through the inlet here at the mouth at Hampton. And so there's low marsh, there's high marsh, and there are mudflat environments there. It's a mix of sand and mud, depending on where you are in the estuary. And it has significant importance to the communities there for coastal resiliency and ecosystem services. There have been lots of studies having to do with flooding and inundation and so forth. We're most interested in the marsh itself. And just to let you know, the hydrodynamics that drive the flow in the estuary are driven by the tides, primarily through the shallow inlet at the mouth. So it's a tidally driven flow, which propagates into the marsh itself. Okay, so just to sort of get you oriented there. All right, so the problem, not only at Hampton Seabrook, but at other salt marshes around the world, are that sedimentation rates are not keeping up with the rise. Okay, so the result ends up being that low marsh turns into mudflat over time, and high marsh turns into low marsh. And you have a concomitant loss of ecosystem services provided by the marsh, which results, again, in a reduction in coastal resiliency and increased risk to the communities. This is a well-known problem. There's nothing new about that. But from the Hampton Seabrook salt marsh, we actually have some observations. And these are all from Dave Burdick, who's been working in the marsh for many years, but for the past 10 years has been measuring changes to the sediment levels in different low marsh areas within the estuary. And he does these with surface elevation tables. I'm not sure exactly how they work. I think you basically stick them out there and then you measure how much sand gets and mud gets accumulated on them over time. And here's the time series over that 10 years for the 6 different locations. And I didn't actually identify where they were, but they're scattered throughout the marsh. But all of them clearly show an increase in sedimentation over time. And all of them are at about the same rate of about 2.5 millimeters per year. This to me was amazing when I saw it. I would have thought that there would be a lot of scatter in this data, but it's pretty consistent amongst all the different signs, and it's very tightly coupled. The correlation coefficients are super high. So it's a really good estimate for what the sedimentation rate is in the estuary itself. The problem is that sea level rise is about 50% higher or faster than the sedimentation rates. So over time, sea level rise is inevitably going to overtake the marsh itself. And the low marsh will turn into mudflat and so forth, and there'll be a loss of ecosystem services. This is not unknown in other places. This is a big problem worldwide because of all the carbon storage and among many other things. So what can you do about that? Well, you could try to stop sea level rise. That's difficult. Especially as climate sort of slowly evolves over time. It's going to be difficult to stop that. But perhaps we can increase the sedimentation rates. Is that a solution? Can we increase the sedimentation rates perhaps by pumping additional sediments into the spring tides or the flood tides of the currents and have the hydrodynamic forces actually deposit the sediments naturally onto the marsh itself? So increase the amount of the sediments on the flood to help sediment the marshes. That's been termed a mud motor by the people who actually come up with this. These are Dutch scientists and so forth who have been doing a lot of large scale coastal evolution kinds of things. And they thought, well, why don't we just pump this sediments into the flood tide and see how well it works? We're sort of borrowing that idea. Can we actually increase the sedimentation rates in these marsh environments to help the marshes grow at a rate that won't be overcome by sea level rise? Okay, so let me give you some idea what a mud motor might look like. So what you're seeing here is the estuary and a simulation of particles that are being artificially pumped into the flow. Okay, so this is a model. This is run by Jang Nguyen. He basically has a regional ocean modeling system. I won't talk too much about that, but this becomes a central part of our work that we're doing here. It's got about 6 meters horizontal resolution with 5 vertical layers. It's forced by the tides and so forth. It has wetting and drying and all the nice things that you want in a tidally driven estuary. Okay, so what we're showing here are the flows that are out of the model. We can take this and do offline particle tracking. And at this location right here, we're going to pump 50,000 particles evenly over time, over 6 hours into the flow. And you're watching how that evolves in time. So the particles are being advected and diffused by the flow. Eventually, they get high enough to get up onto the marsh, and then a bunch of the particles exit on the ebb tide. This is just repeating itself, as you can see, every tidal cycle. Many of the particles end up getting trapped on the marsh itself. Caveat, we're not doing anything to trap those. We have no vegetation in this model. We have no fluid, sediment, vegetation interactions. The particles are being left behind because the flow slows down and then settles on the marsh. And once it gets below a certain level, whatever particles are in the flow stay on the marsh. So we have a lot of work to do to figure out exactly how those sediments are going to be deposited and how much mud we would need to put into the water itself in order to increase the sedimentation rates on some reasonable sort of basis. One of the big unknowns for us is that we don't really know things about the dispersion. So the dispersion has to do with parameterizing scales that are subgrid scale. So if we have scales that are larger than our grid, we can use advection for the most part to understand what's happening because we'll have resolved those scales. And we can compare our flows predicted by the model with observations of flows, which you do very well. Salome showed she could do this. This is a common way of verifying models. But we have very little understanding of the dispersive process or the turbulent processes that have scales smaller than 6 meters in this case. We're using a coefficient here of 1 meter squared per second, which is the sort of accepted rate for a lot of estuarine type of modeling that's been done, especially in this area.
What's the size of the particles you're releasing? Are they essentially one cell size? Or?
They're much smaller than a cell. They're infinitesimally small, basically, and they just get advected from place to place.
Which is density?
You basically interpolate within the different grid cells to see how far they move. So you basically advect them with the flow, and you use a random walk model with this dispersion to actually artificially account for the turbulence. Yeah. Okay, so we could also put these particles and initiate them in different locations. Here's another idea where we could pump them in here. And in this case, the particles are going to be deposited on this part of the marsh itself. Or we can pump them in on the other side, and they're going to end up being over here. So there's more than just understanding the physics of the flow. It's actually how you might do this in the end. We need the models to basically understand that. So, question, can we enhance the sedimentation rates ultimately by pumping sediments into the marsh? And will it accrete fast enough to keep up with sea level rise? What are the practicalities of that? Which would be important for the coastal protection and long-term health of the system itself. Okay, so we need to improve the model to estimate the enhanced sedimentation rates on the marsh. And there's lots that's going to go into that. But that's kind of the underlying theme of why we're pursuing this work. And there'll be many different components associated with that. The first is that we want to verify the model. That'll be both the flows, the advected flows, and the dispersion. I'll talk a little bit about the advected flows later, but not a lot. And I'll just rely on you to believe in me that we're doing very well with that. The dispersion, not so much. The GPS drifters, which we're going to deploy, Lagrangian drifters, are going to be used to estimate dispersion coefficients that we can then incorporate in the model. And we want to estimate those as a function of space, different locations in the estuary, and over time, meaning the different tidal cycles and so forth. Once we estimate those coefficients, we can incorporate them in the model, but now we need to test the dispersion in the model. That's what we want to do with fluorescent dye tracing. We're going to pump fluorescent dye into the water. We're going to fly drones and stuff over it And we're going to watch that dye expand, and then we're going to compare our model predictions with the dye predictions. Okay, but we also need to understand things about the fine scale fluid, sediment, and vegetation interactions. How are the sediments trapped on the marsh? How does turbulence and so forth and interactions with the flow and the vegetation affect that sedimentation? And that's going to lead to better parameterization for the model, either within ROMs, we'll develop models for ROMs, or we'll use the offline particle tracking stuff that Jang has developed, which is my preference. So we're going to do small scale field experiments. We're going to observe the flow, turbulence, dissipation, and so forth in and around these salt marsh areas. And then eventually we're going to do some laboratory flume experiments with detailed fluid sediment interaction. I'll show some pictures of the flume and some of the directions that we're headed here coming up. And finally, we need to understand and learn about the plant properties. We need to measure vegetation stalk dimensions, density, canopy height, things of that nature, and understand what the sedimentation rates are where we are and the grain size distributions, because those are going to be important for when we actually get to the model itself. So lots going on, lots of collaborators, and much to do. So let's talk a little bit about each one of these in turn. So the one I'm going to probably spend the most time on is the GPS surface drifters, which we're going to need to estimate the diffusivity coefficients. Okay, so we're going to use these Pacific gyre drifters. We're also going to use some from Coastal Measures, which were a new drifter that was developed by Josh Humberston, who many of you might know. He started his own company. On the side, Coastal Measures will also be using his drifters, but they're all basically the same thing. They have a GPS on it, and they move passively with the flow. And they measure their position. That's the basic measurement that we're making, just the position of a drifter that's floating through the water. And it's going to be affected by whatever dynamics associated that are larger than the whatever that particular element is. And these drifters have been shown to move pretty freely with the flow. And they have a relatively low surface expression, and so the windage on it is non-zero, but it is, we think, relatively weak. Okay, so that's the basis of the flow. Put the drifters in the water, watch them flow through the estuary, and then estimate the diffusivity. And we'll do that with one particle statistics. And I want to talk just a little bit about that. I'm not going to belabor it, but it's been around for a while. Davis in 1983, when all the Lagrangian drifter stuff was being developed in oceanography, basically developed all the basis for much of the work that we do on diffusivity. And these are tensors that depend on the two-dimensional directions of the flow and the cross diffusivity kinds of things for rotational elements. And it's essentially an integral of a velocity correlation. This could be U and V, or U and U and V and V, and so forth, of a drifter at a position, a particular position at a particular time, and the velocity of a particle at a previous time that ends up at that position and time later. So it's an integral back in time. And so the diffusivity is based on some lag associated with that. So you estimate those diffusivity values, and then you can estimate the overall diffusivity for the different components. The residual velocities are just given by the velocity at that time t naught minus the average of all the flow values of all the Lagrangian drifters at that time. So we're looking at deviations in velocities associated with that relative to the mean that's averaged in that area. I should point out that I didn't actually calculate it this way, because I can carry out that integral through this term here and as enter displacements, which makes it a little bit easier to calculate, but that's the nature and basis of the calculation itself. Okay, so what does this mean? So this is a schematic showing the position of a GPS drifter through time. There's a spatial map. Here's the position at time t1 with its easting and its northing in with some error associated with that. And I'm just assuming that the errors in easting and northing are the same, although they might not be for the GPS drifters. And then here's another position a short time later with its own error, which may not be the same, and so forth. So that's the basic measurement, the position with some error associated with that. I can compute a velocity by looking at the difference between those positions any particular time. The distance traveled divided by that time interval, right? Pretty straightforward. But the errors in the velocity are going to be related to the errors associated with the drifters. If the spatial distance is large, meaning this time interval is large, which is what normally happens in the open ocean, then these errors are typically small compared to that distance, right? You move 30 kilometers and you have a small error. doesn't really matter. For just diffusivity estimates in the nearshore area, which haven't really been made, this type of them is small. And so these errors can potentially become large relative to the distance that's traveled, especially if the flow is pretty weak. The error can be that large. That's difficult to deal with. So if these errors from one point to the next in the GPS system are slowly varying, then those errors are going to cancel. And you got a GPS position here, short time later, even though you're in the wrong position, if the error is the same, then that error is going to go away and your velocity is pretty good. That's the nature and the basis of doing Lagrangian experiments in the ocean. Lots of people are doing this now with autonomous GPS in the nearshore environment with surface currents and so forth. And they assume that these errors are small enough that they don't influence the overall estimate of the velocities. Okay, but we need to test that. We're not really sure that that's the case because of the dynamics of the drifters themselves and the changing constellations and so forth. We're going to actually test that. Okay, so we're also going to estimate the diffusivity in particular regions. So the drifter is passing through a grid of some kind with a defined width. This might be 20 meters, for example. So anytime a drifter was in that box, maybe it's 100 meters, whatever that happens to be, it'll appear at some time at some position. And I can go back in time and estimate the velocities at previous positions so that and integrate that and eventually get to my diffusivity estimate for all of the individual boxes. So for this box, for every drifter that passes through that box at any particular time interval, I can estimate a diffusivity and average that. And that's the measurement that I'll make. So we tested this in the Great Bay. Okay, so this is not Hampton. This is 2019. We did a bunch of deployments over many different tidal cycles, all of them done by John Hunt at different times of the day and different tidal cycles. And these are all the different trajectories from that. So we can use that information then to estimate the velocities. And this was done by Anna Marie Martel as part of her master's thesis project. And I'm just showing you time series over 3 or 4 hours of the magnitude and direction of the velocities for the 3 drifters that were put out. Here's the east velocity and the north velocity. So they're moving through the estuary to a different location, right? So the velocities that are measured here are not taken from the same place that the velocities were measured here. This is a Lagrangian velocity time series that the drifter itself is experiencing. So for those of you who are really good with time series analysis will know that this is a non-stationary time series, right? Because the processes at one location in the estuary may be different than somewhere else. And supposedly you can't do any spectral analysis with that. I'm going to blow right past that. We're going to do the spectrum because we don't care about that nonlinearity or that non-stationary behavior. Even if I misrepresent those low frequency signals, I don't care. All I want to estimate is the errors associated with my drifter. The high frequency stuff that's uncertain. That will be the same whether it's Lagrangian or whether it's Eulerian. So I can estimate a spectrum now. So this is now frequency on a log scale on the horizontal axis and spectral power on the vertical axis for the east velocities and north velocity drifters. There's 3 different drifters for this particular day. And you can see that the low frequencies are much more energetic than the high frequencies. We're not representing those well because of the non-stationarity issues. But I'm interested in this part of the spectrum out here. Where does the spectrum actually flatten out? And I can estimate then the error associated with that signal. And we can do this in a number of different ways. We can do raw estimates every second. We can average them together. And this is what Anne Marie did as part of her thesis. What kinds of processing can we do to reduce the errors? What kinds of situations are we get where it's not going to work very well? So she did this for all the different runs. Here are the different dates that we had for our runs and the 3 different drifters and the errors in the easting and the northing velocity. Most of the errors for drifter 2 and 3 are around 2 to 3 centimeters per second. That's pretty good for an autonomous GPS drifters. And that happens most of the time, relatively small. But there are also times when the error gets large, especially for this drifter 1, which is horrible, right? It's out there at the same time. So there are issues also with the drifters and the GPS and electronics that actually come into play. Even though they're in the same place, seeing the same constellation, they sometimes behave just a little bit differently, and you have to be careful. But generally speaking, the errors are relatively low. But you do need to do some analysis to verify that your errors are low. If you're actually trying to estimate velocities that are slow in area or estimate velocities when they're relatively small. Okay, so a few centimeters per second errors for the drifters that we've been able to realize in the estuary itself. Okay, so you can then calculate the mean Lagrangian velocities of all the drifters over all the times. And here's the average for these flows, which range from a few centimeters per second, around 10, to about 2.5 meters per second in some of the faster parts of the estuary. And here are the estimates spatially of the diffusivities, which range from 0 to 5 for most of it. And these high diffusivities around 5 are really high and occur in places that we're clearly getting errors that are occurring here on the edges of the estuary and so forth. But we can actually look at the distribution of those values. I'm showing you that here. Here are the diffusivity estimates, and here's the count for those estimates. Almost all of those estimates are well below 1. In fact, they're about an order of magnitude smaller than the diffusivities that have been used in most models to estimate, for example, residence time in the estuary. Bill Gilly and others were using pretty much 1 for most of that. That's pretty high relative to what we're actually finding with our drifters. And there's some other stuff we've noticed here is that the current magnitude diffusivities are relatively independent of that, but suggests that the shear dispersion associated with sheared flow, especially in high velocity regions, are probably not impacting our estimates of the diffusivity. The shear flow basically means that you're fast in one area. If you move a little bit, the shear of the flow causes your drifter to actually experience changes in the flow. Part of that is reduced by the fact that we're using the integral of the velocity times its distance, which I didn't really want to get into, but that's sort of why we've been able to sort of reduce that dependence. Okay, so the order of magnitude of the dispersion is about, or the diffusivity is about an order of magnitude less than what's previously thought. So we've been doing a bunch more deployments in Hampton. Again, John's been going down there, dumping a bunch of drifters in, they're moving around. We have to filter those data. You can see there's times when it just doesn't, drifter 1 just doesn't behave very well at times. And so we have to throw some of that data out. For the most part, I'm just grinding through it at this stage to see what kind of values we're getting. So we can compute, again, Lagrangian velocities here, which also range relatively small values, anywhere from 10 centimeters to 0.5 meter per second for much of the estuary where the drifters were. And sometimes they're getting a bunch higher here, of course, in the inland environment. And here are the diffusivity distributions also ranging from 0 to 5. More instructive, actually, to take a look at the distribution. Most of the diffusivities are less than 1. Surprisingly to me, I thought that diffusivities would be smaller in Hampton than they would be in the Great Bay. Much narrower channels, but maybe that's causing more fluid to be interacting with the sidewalls and so forth, generating actually a little bit more turbulence maybe than we actually experienced in the Great Bay. The other thing I want to point out is that those diffusivities only occur where the drifters actually are moving. And they're moving in the channels. They're not drifting across the top of the marsh at high tide because they get stuck. And then we don't get any measurements at all. So these estimates of diffusivity are actually in the channels. The diffusivities in the marshes are going to be much, much more difficult for us to estimate. And we expect them to be much, much smaller because of the drag associated with the marsh itself. So this is where the dye tracing experiments are going to help us as well. Can we actually use spatially varying diffusivity coefficients and estimate what they should be over the marsh in order to reproduce what we see with the dye when we get to that point? Okay. All right, so more with the model. So we talked about the diffusivities. I mentioned that we're using this Fromm's model. It's driven by the Gulf of Maine forecasting system and the tides. And we've got a bunch of sensors here that we put in the water for Kate von Krusenstier's thesis, and Jang has been using that data to verify that his model is working, and these are the sea surface elevation time series comparisons. Works really well. You also have velocity comparisons that also works really well. We're super happy. This 6.6 meter resolution is 25 times actually better than what Kate had used. And so we're really getting down to the point where we're able to actually model some pretty significant flow characteristics within the estuary. We're getting pretty happy with that. There's other good things about the model, but let's just move on. Okay, so here's our model. Once again, the flows are verified with the ADCP measurements and pressure measurements throughout the estuaries, and we've estimated the diffusivity. Again, we need to incorporate a better dispersion number, probably about 1/10 of what we've been using for this one. And so this is ongoing work. We're going to actually incorporate these spatial varying coefficients as we actually obtain more data in the estuary and move forward with that. Okay. All right, so once we incorporated that diffusivity, we can model the particles with more confidence, but we don't know if it's working. I really don't know whether that's really going to be what's actually going to represent what's happening, especially in parts of the estuary where we're most interested. Over the marsh, we don't have any estimates of GPS drifters. So this is where the dye tracing experiments come in. So our plan here is to pump water tracing non-toxic rhodamine dye into the water. This is not the first time this has been done. People have been doing this in the near shore as well for some time. And then we're going to use hyperspectral cameras on drones. This is Mike Pallas and Frankie Sullivan to fly over the area and measure the rhodamine concentration based on the reflectance characteristics from the hyperspectral cameras. And we'll compare it to observations of the rhodamine dye from sondes that are basically moving around in the estuary on these small boats. We'll drive around with the small boats, measure the concentration while we're dumping the dye in at a known rate, at a known concentration, and then compare that to the drone. Okay, so we did a couple of tests. The first one was in July down here in Hampton. So we were pumping a bunch of dye in on the outgoing tide. And this is just the, I think this is the median concentration of the dye at any of these locations. So the boat's moving around, doing its thing, and measuring the dye concentration. At the same time, the hyperspectral camera is moving back and forth across the estuary. And then we went again in October to our site that we were most interested in. Here were our field studies for the small scale experiments, and pumped a bunch of dye on the flood tide to see what happens to the dye as it comes up in on a spring tide and how it spreads around. And these are the sort of spatial variability of that data. You can also see that these numbers are pretty small. Oh, I don't even have the units. Parts per billion. 4 parts per billion are those yellow ones. It's just a few parts per billion that we're actually measuring with the dye concentration sensors. It's not a huge amount, even though we're putting in significant concentration when we're dumping it in. Stuff you can actually see with your eye. Okay. On that initial test, these are just some of the images that they looked at. The things I wanted to show you are that they can compute a real RGB image. We can false color that, and you can actually do stuff with it. We didn't do much with it for this particular one, but you can look at the ratio of the 582 nanometer wavelength, which is the reflectance. That's the wavelength at which the dye reflects, and the 540 band, which is the one that it actually absorbs. So you get the ratio of those to really see where the dye is located and do some value concentrations for that. These dots are sampled locations where we started to actually compare the concentration that was measured by the boats with the concentration that's measured by the hyperspectral cameras at the time when they were both coincidentally in the same place. And we're still working on that. I should also point out that these sensors fly for about 20 minutes. It takes about 20 minutes to do one of the patterns. So it's not ever going to be an instantaneous measurement when we're using the drone. But we'll work on transitioning those hyperspectral cameras to light aircraft. And there's the Lightheart organization, lighthawk.org, which they're volunteering to do studies like this, and they use airplanes for these kinds of studies. So we're looking at sort of getting a larger scale approach as well. We also did some tests here at the end of August, or October, I mean. And here we have a picture. This is a panoramic picture, basically looking out over the estuary. And here's the dye tracing as it's moving through the water. Here's our little boat moving around, and the dye is coming up and being moved onto the marsh itself. There's another picture of them. This is Savannah and John moving around the estuary, measuring the dye. The concentration, again, 0 to 4 parts per billion, spreading out over the whole estuary. So it's certainly actually moving around. We should be able to see it with the cameras themselves. So the processing of that's taking some time, especially for the georeferencing, which has been very difficult for them, but we're working on it. This is an example of a band average RGB image. So basically took all these bands. There's something like 273 bands of the hyperspectral camera. They're averaging them and recreating an image. So you can actually see the color content here. This is often what you see in journals. They publish these false colored images so you can really see where the dye is. You can also do other things. Here, Mike chose one in the red, the green, and the blue bands. It's near infrared on this side. That's the range. And you can see that you can do different things with different bands to see different things in the images. The most instructive one is, of course, when you look at the ratio of the reflectance wavelength, 580 nanometers compared to the absorbing one. This is where you really get an enhanced system where everything else goes away and what you're left with is the dye itself. And these are relatively high concentrations here, and you can really start to see it start to spread out as the dye moves and is ejected away from the source location. Mike also sent me a couple pictures showing it further away, far away from the sensor, and you can actually see some of the dye tracing here. These are where you have just few parts per billion, and you can actually pick it up quite well. Very sensitive with the hyperspectral cameras, especially when you look at the ratio between 580 to 540 nanometers. These are methodologies that have been used by others as well. And so we're actually just borrowing their methodologies to help understand how that dye is being advected throughout the estuary. We're going to use that information ultimately to compare against the modeling. Okay, so more on that later. Let's talk a little bit about the fine scale field experiments. These are done by Tracy, Elijah, and Diane. And here we are with our field site over here. This is also the same place where we were doing those dye tracing things. We're really interested in this marsh. This is a good place for us to study and see how well this is going to work. This is a close-up of the field site. The main element of the array is this transect across from the mudflat, across the low marsh, and up into the high marsh. And there were 3 locations here where we had Nortec vectors measuring ADV measurements a certain distance above the bottom so we can get the high frequency turbulence, and some YSE-ISONs that are measuring turbidity at 2 different elevations. I'll show you some more pictures of that later. We also have some capacitance wave gauges that we moved around a little bit to measure sea surface slopes. And from the sea surface slopes, we can estimate a drag. I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. It can be compared to the turbulence measurements that we're getting from our high frequency velocity measurements. There were some upward looking ADCPs to measure the overall flow. And then there's some locations where we're measuring the sediments, so we understand what kinds of sediments are there and what the changes in the sediments are as you move across the transect. And finally, there's a camera over here, which I'll show some pictures of just to show you as the tides come in and inundate the marsh area itself. All right, so here's another picture of the marsh. Here we are looking back towards the estuary here. From the top, there's a bunch of capacitance wave gauges up to measure those sea surface slopes. Here we are standing in the channel looking back at the array. We've got, here we have a capacitance gauge. We had an ADCP near the bottom, it's not shown here. Here we have an ADV measuring the velocities very, very near the edge of the marsh with 2 turbulence sensors. Turbidity sensors separated in the vertical. We have another one here in the middle, and then we have a third one up on the high marsh. So 3 different locations. You can see the capacitance gauges nearby. And here's Elijah here working in the estuary itself. She spent a lot of time out there, and he did really well. So it's a fun place to work, isn't it? Okay. This is a little movie basically showing 24 hours basically as the water comes up into the marsh, inundates, and then goes back down. And so we're watching the flow as it comes across the marsh. It's going to carry whatever sediments are with it, and the flow is going to respond to the characteristics of the marsh itself, how many plants there are, the turbulence from the wakes and the stems and so forth, and we can take a look at that. The interesting thing about these times is that the highest tides are actually in the middle of the night. During the daytime high tides, because it's a semi-diurnal, they didn't actually get as high as they did at night. Doesn't really matter to us, but it was just more difficult for us to actually see at that time. Okay. So here's a schematic that Eli made, basically to scale, actually showing where the water levels are. So this is low tide, there's high tide on average. There's an ADCP in the channel. Here we have the capacitance gauge. Here we have the ADV measuring near bed high frequency velocities. And here we have turbulence at 2 different locations above the bed. Similarly, we have another ADV here, a couple of other sensors and so forth. And these plant heights we measured throughout the summer. So we go back periodically to measure those heights, and these are actually representative of what they were at some point during the time that we were there. Okay? There's also another capacitance gauge here and another one here. So we can actually measure the sea surface slope from here as the flow comes across the marsh and measure it here. That's difficult to actually level those sensors. And so the way that we did that here was we waited until high tide, when we know that the flow has stopped and it's going to reverse. And we just assumed that it was level at that time. The flow comes up and it stops, everything settles out and it's flat. So you can level it at the point when the velocities actually stop. That's what we did. So you know, when I show you these a little bit later. The other thing I wanted to show you is that the sediments change as you move across from the channel up to the high marsh. These are sediment grain size distributions. It's hard to probably see where you are, but there's 96% sand in the channel. There's only about 4% mud. You thought Hampton was filled with mud. Not really. It's actually filled with sand. There's a huge perched, marsh on top of a bunch of sand. There's mostly sand there. As you start moving across the low marsh into the high marsh, you get progressively more mud. To the point when you're up in the high marsh, you're actually getting 60% mud up here. So the mud is being trapped up on the low marsh and the high marsh, as we would expect, owing probably a lot to these plants. The sand can't be transported across that, right? Sand falls to the bottom, transports by bed load mostly, and it gets blocked by the marsh itself. So the flow that actually stirs up the mud, propagates into the marsh, gets knocked out of suspension by the stalks, but it won't necessarily settle, right? Even though the bed stress is weak near the bottom, right? Because the flow is weak, flow is high up here, it's weaker down here because of the vegetation. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the sediment can just settle out. This is what I always thought. That's what I was telling everybody until Tracy said, no, you're wrong. They're actually finding that the turbulent wakes around these stalks are actually what potentially are keeping the sediments up in suspension. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that process. And Tracy, you can correct me as I start saying things that are wrong. Okay. So both she and Anna, see Anna in the background, she's checking me for the stuff. So you have vegetation and you have flow within that vegetation. And sometimes the canopy doesn't go all the way to the surface. So the flow structure looks a little bit different. When it's at the surface, the whole thing is covered by the canopy, and you have a flow structure that's reduced by the fact that there's drag and there's a boundary layer near the bottom. Here you have, again, a boundary layer near the bottom, but the flow actually gets stronger up above, right? Because the flow is not impacted by the canopy here, but it is strongly impacted here. So sediments that get down in here get knocked out of suspension and they can fall to the bottom where the bed stress is weak compared to a time when it is actually being, when there's no vegetation. But there are, let me see here, remind me what I wanted to say. Bed stress may not be the best indicator of that transport. And it may be that the turbulent wakes coming off these stems and that turbulence is what keeps the sediments from settling out or allows them to settle out. So it's the turbulence actually that we're most interested in our work. And it's mostly generated by the wakes of the stems. It's not generated by the shear stress at the bed. It's generated by the horizontal wakes across the stems themselves. Okay, so research questions that we're after here. How well do the turbulent-based indicators for sediment suspension and transport actually work? Are there correlations, connections between the turbulence and the turbidity that we're actually measuring? How do the flow and turbulence characteristics vary when you transition from the mud flat up onto the high marsh? So can we measure these across the transect, and we can learn something about them? And we're also interested in how the plants themselves are filtering the sediments in ways that we don't fully understand. Okay, some of the observations, which I found a little bit interesting. So here we have about 5 days of observations, and I'm showing turbidity here in the channel. And so there's a sensor that's near the bottom, that's the blue. And here's a sensor in the red that's near the top. So what you notice here is that the turbidity near the bottom is much higher than the turbidity further away from the bottom. That's because all those sediments have settled out, right? the turbulence is generated at the bed, and it takes time for the sediments to get up into the water column and a bunch of them settle out. So there's a gradient in the turbidity with clear water above and more turbulent or turbid water below. That's not true once you get into the marsh itself. Now the turbulence from the wakes and stems and so forth has homogenized the water column, and the turbidity at the surface is about, or in the mid-water column there, is about the same as it is near the bed. The turbulence is actually increased as you moved up into the water column because of that decay. That's the way we're looking at that. And so we need to look, of course, at the relationship to the turbulence. We need to look at the measurements of that. And we're just starting to basically look at that. So I want to look a little bit at the turbulence here for the high flow conditions. These are high flows for us, 5 to 10 centimeters per second within the marsh, 35 centimeters per second in the channel itself. And we're showing the channel, and then the mid-marsh location, and then the upper marsh location. And for the vertical velocities, there's about an f to the minus 5/3 decay, consistent with Kolmogorov scaling throughout the inertial subrange, suggesting turbulent dissipation in the vertical. But the horizontal, not so much. Those horizontal velocities do not show that same decay, suggesting that there's an asymmetric eddy production and horizontal wake turbulence that's existing in this flow. That's all I want to say about that. But if you look at the low flow environments, or periods where you have just a few centimeters per second flow and relatively weaker flow in the channels, now your horizontal velocities are also decaying at the high frequencies at that f to the minus 5/3 decay, suggesting symmetric eddy dissipation at those Kolmogorov scales. And so there's a fundamental change between the low and the high flow environments, something that we need to investigate, and then look at that in comparison to the turbidity. That's where we're headed with this. Okay. I want to comment a little bit about sea surface slopes. So we can estimate slopes across the marsh by using those capacitance gauges. And these are the gauges where we have leveled those based on the high tide period when we assume that all of the flow has stopped. So it's reached its highest point. We've assumed that it stopped in our marsh. We're assuming that it's level. And then we can look at a small area here. This is just over a couple of hours where we can see the channel sensor has higher elevation than the sensors up on the marsh. And that's about 2 to 3 centimeters. So there's about a 2 to 3 centimeter change in elevation over this 10 meters between those sensors. All right, so that's a sea surface slope associated with that. And that's induced by the fact that the flow is being affected by the drag in the marsh itself. Okay, so we can calculate what that drag coefficient is. This is based on the Baroni work from 2000, which I basically pulled out. And you can calculate the drag if you assume horizontally average momentum equations integrated from depth from the top of the canopy to the surface to get that stress right at the top of the canopy, and then insert that representation within the canopy. You can eventually solve, and I'm not going to go through the details of that, for the drag coefficient as a function of a number of variables that include the ratio of the water depth to the height of the canopy. So if it's an emergent bed, then the height of the canopy is the same as the water depth. That number is equal to 1. Right? The plants reach all the way to the surface. Here's the sea surface slope, which is a few centimeters for us over about 10 meters. So that's our slope we measured. We can assume this one based on our measurements for that particular time, based on our measurements of the canopy. Then there's this other variable here called A, which is the normalized plant density, which depends on the number of plants per square area times the frontal cross-sectional area, and then as a function of depth, depending on where you are. There's pictures of reeds and so forth moving up into the water column. So for slope that we observe, using a value, we have not calculated this from our measurements yet, that was provided by Nept and Baroni from about 3 to 6 for this value of A, using our velocities of about 10 centimeters per second and a fully developed canopy height, we get a drag coefficient from about 1/2 to about 2, which is roughly in the range of what we would expect for other work that's done in these areas. What's often done is you assume what the drag coefficient is and work your way backwards to figure out what those sea surface slopes are, we're going to try to estimate what that drag is, and then relate that to the turbulent dissipation that we're measuring with the ADVs. So again, we're headed in that direction with that. Okay, couple comments here to wrap up, having to do with plant stems, density, and so forth across the low to high marsh area. Again, this is from Dave Burdick. He had a couple of transects here very close to where we were. So he's now measuring accretion rates and a bunch of plant properties to measure their densities. And he wants to see how those are changing over the last year. So this is only 1 year of data, where I showed you before the accumulation rates from the set tables. That was over a 10-year period. And we were getting rates of about 2.5 millimeters per year. This is the data that he provided for us. The horizontal axis is distance along the transect. Here we're at the edge of the low marsh on this side, and here we're at the edge of the high marsh over here. And we have two different transects. The orange and the blue are one transect, and the yellow and the gray are the other transect. The stem heights are in blue here and in yellow. No, and in gray, and the sediment accumulations are in yellow and in orange. Okay, so to help me summarize, when you have high plant density, you get high accretion rates. So there's lots of plants here, high density, and you're getting high accretion rates. In the other location, you have very low plant density. The snails actually denuded the entire low marsh area. So there aren't any plants. And the sedimentation rates are really, really small there relative to what we're seeing up here. Notice that these rates are high, much higher than what he's getting in the other areas. And we don't really understand, I think, that spatial variability at this point. The point being is that where there's lots of plants, lots of sedimentation, this is consistent with everything we know about how plants are good trappers for sediments, right? Carbon stores, that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is relatively new data that he's been looking at. Oh, I forgot. I did want to comment about the lab experiments that are going forward. Tracy's built a new floam. You've probably all seen it out in the tank. And it has a bunch of characteristics she sent me. It's about 10 meters long, and I think there's a portion of that that's the actual workable area, 8 meters, half meter across. Velocity ranges up to 40 centimeters per second, and it tilts, right? So you can create a slope, which is useful. And you can do a bunch of measurements within that tank. So it's recirculating flow. And what they're doing, they're sticking a bunch of plants in here. So these, you'll see Eli and Tracy and Terry and other people putting all these little artificial blades of eelgrass in there, whatever plants that they want to use so they can start to look at that. That was pretty cool. Let's watch that again. I was really interested to see this, and I think this stuff this is called Monami, right? This is Monami, right? So there's fluctuations in the flow that you can really see in this. And they were also, by the way, this is from Ocean Discovery Day. They were also pumping some dye into the flow down here and pumping it in up here. I didn't actually get a video of that, but the flow down here goes really slow, right? And the dye up here just whips along. So you can really see the difference between what's going on outside the canopy and what's going on inside. That's not necessarily new, but this is, they can reproduce what we see in the field, and then they can start making measurements in detail that we can't actually do in the field. So hopefully the field measurements will inform what we do in the lab, and then hopefully that will be helpful to help parameterize some of those processes. All right, just coming back to what we started with, sedimentation rates are not high enough in the Hampton Seabrook Estuary to keep up with sea level. And so we're looking at other potential methodologies. We didn't invent it, but we're basically going to see if it actually would be something that's useful. And we're going to learn a bunch about how that sedimentation occurs within the estuary itself. All right, some summaries. I'll just be very quick. Our hydrodynamic model, we have it. We'll be doing offline particle tracking, and we have verified those things with flow measurements, but we need to do things with dye to get our dispersion understood. We've estimated the diffusivity. We need to do more experiments with that to quantify that a little bit better, especially for the spatial variability. The dye tracing, I'm super excited about that. I'm really happy and hoping that this is gonna work out really well for us, and I'm super confident that it will be. Scale experiments are really showing us some interesting stuff. There's lots more work to be analyzed with that data. We have a lot of data to look at. And there's lots of theory and sort of stuff to go along with that for predictions. We're working on that. Both the turbulence, the turbidity, and the sea surface slopes are all consistent with what we're finding about turbulence and the drag within these marshes. And there's some other things having to do with set data. And eventually we're going to get to small scale experiments at the lab. Okay, thank you.
What do you make of the fact that the spectral estimates of the GPS Lagrangian velocities you don't ever hit the noise floor?
They just hit the noise floor at the end, which is, well, they're flattening out just at the very high frequency end. So I showed you one example of those. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether we were hitting the noise floor. We're definitely got noise in the sensors. If we were not, you can reduce that noise by averaging, but we're hitting that noise floor.
Would it be helpful just to do that same test, but just leave the drifter like in the parking lot?
We have,
Yeah.
because you're basically you're jumping around and that kind of thing. So they're slowly varying things. That's definitely gonna be a part of what we're doing in the estuary itself. And it can be bad at times with poor satellite constellations and things like that. The airs can be much worse, especially when it's catching and losing satellites, without a doubt.
Yeah, so, okay, so on that, I guess kind of on that line, when you had that plot of showing the error versus time over several days, you did have those pretty severe spikes. And there was one that was particularly severe in comparison to the others. Do you guys have any idea as to
No.
why I think that would happen? No?
We have no idea. That particular sensor has been problematic. At times it works beautifully with the other sensors, and other times they can be right next to each other for 3 hours and be very, very poor. And we even noticed it even down in Hampton. And so, the more sensors we have, we're actually moving away from the reef drifters. They're okay. I don't want to complain about those, but Josh's sensors, I think, are going to be a little bit more helpful to us for some of the things that we're doing.
I thought that you had said that the presence of plants will increase turbulence and may keep sediment from settling because of the increased turbulence. But then the conclusion at the end was that more plants trap sediment. Can you help me with that?
So the plants will trap more sediment than if you don't have it there. The nature of that settling is unknown, whether that's because the drag is weaker at the bottom or whether the turbulence allows it to happen. So understanding sort of how that happens is probably important. If you only consider the drag, sedimentation rates might be much higher than they are actually with turbulence. So the turbulence may reduce the amount of settling, but they're still settling.
Okay, thanks. And my follow-up is I've been on an olivine kick lately.
What?
An olivine kick lately.
Let's move on.
And it's my impression that it is heavier than quartz. So if you want, what you want is sediment to settle quickly. If you're in fact going to encourage a mud motor, and in fact you want to positively affect marsh growth, then you need stuff to settle out quickly. I'm not recommending that we start using lead pellets. I need to be really clear.
That's how we solve global warming.
Well, that's one of the proposals, right?
This is a really good question because if you're pumping sediments in and they settle out quickly, they're not even going to make it to the marsh. So they got to stay in suspension long enough to get to the marsh. So you're really looking at mud and stuff like that. Sand is going to fall out quickly. And so it's the fine scale stuff. The nature of that fine scale stuff might make a big difference. So there might be grain sizes that or types of elements that would be important for that. I would find it difficult, I think, to do that on a large scale. I think you're going to be stuck with what you got, or dredged material or something nearby. We've also wondered about what you could maybe increase the particle size by maybe pumping a little fresh water in with you to create a stratification layer. And maybe that would stay stratified long enough to get stuff onto the marsh. That's the second question. So we're sort of working on that later once we sort of understand better about what's happening.
Thanks.
Let's go with Ann and then come over to.
I'm biased, but I think this is a fantastic project and I'm really excited to see the range of scales that you're encompassing from the very large scale to the very small scale. I guess one question, many ditches, many salt marshes in the Northeast are ditched, mosquito ditches. People went out and they were worried about drainage, so they went out and they dug ditches in many of these. I think Hampton Seabrook was ditched.
Yes.
And that at least some of those ditches are intact. And I was wondering how that was. I'm sure Jake's model is fantastic, but 6-meter resolution is not going to be able to take into account ditches. So how are you taking that into account?
We're not. No, we can't get that kind of resolution. It won't be.
And does that affect flow over the marsh platform?
Don't know. So what we might, this is a really good question. There are all these man-made ditches out there for those of you who haven't been there, and they're deep, and they haven't filled in over 80 years now. So they dug them, they're deep, they're not filling in. So they're clearly maintaining themselves. And the circulation of the marsh is clearly going to be impacted by that. I think they built those to drain the marsh, right? So they can actually farm stuff there. So the impact on the flow is probably non-zero. My suspicion is we would probably have to nest models within models. So Jang's got a 6-meter model. We could use that to drive a very high resolution CFD model or something within those to see what happens there. It's a really good question. We're not going to get to that large scale, I think, at this point. And I don't know how we would do it for the whole estuary with that scale, just from computational.
I guess I have one follow-up question. Looking at your picture, you're showing the impact of capture on the stems themselves, like the plants get dirty. Is that something that you're taking in, that you're measuring?
No, but that's something maybe Eli can look at. Can you actually? Yeah, so she's basically saying that it's not just the turbulence that allow things to settle. The particles actually hit the plant, stick to it, and they get knocked out of suspension just as much as they get settled out when the flow is around the thing. I don't know. We don't know. We haven't done that. It's a net part of that problem. Could be something that we consider actually in the lab or potentially elsewhere. It's starting to get complicated, without a doubt.
Well, I wanted to zoom out to a bigger, high-level question rather than details of what you're doing. Assuming everything works out, all the research goes ahead, we work out how to do this, so on. What you're proposing is a fairly significant geoengineering thing. When we get to that stage, the question stops being how, but whether we should. What's the discussion around that?
So we've talked a little bit about that. So there's this ecosystem service that's being provided by the marsh, and if you can keep the sedimentation rates going up by pumping something into the marsh, that's great. People have sort of use sprinkler systems to dump sediments onto marshes, but it kind of buries the marsh and it has some negative effects. In this scenario, it's being transported by the flow. Not all the stuff that's in the flow is going to land on the marsh. And it's going to mix into other parts of the estuary. And it's going to influence things like oyster farming and turbidity and things offshore. It could just make an absolute mess. There may be downsides to this that aren't going to let it work, especially if we're talking about mud rather than.
So I was thinking there's potential for unintended
So the model, I think, is going to help us understand where that's going to go. And the dye tracing is going to be really influential to that. So people have done dye tracing in nearshore environments in the past. I've been at some experiments, they were pumping a bunch of dye into the water on an ebb tide. That dye goes offshore and it doesn't go offshore from there. It goes right down the coast and hugs itself to the coast and doesn't leave the nearshore. And a lot of that comes back into the estuary on the next tide. In fact, even in Huntington Beach in California, they put a bunch of dye in the water, the stuff goes out, and within a day, it's 50 miles away. Because there's meter per second currents that keep the dye going all the way upstream. So if there's pollution and things like that in the water, that's problematic, right? You can close the beach where you are, but you've got the same stuff 50 miles away within a day. Same is true for us. The mud is going to go places that we don't want it to go. And that could really be detrimental to some people, especially farmers, oyster farmers and other type of places who use filter feeding kinds of organisms. It's a concern. And so I think our focus is going to be on the sedimentation process. The byproducts of that we'll have to deal with is if it's ever sort of gets to the point where it would be something that would work. I think there's been some experiments that were tried, by the way, in the Netherlands on mud flats. They were not thinking of marsh areas. I think they were thinking of mud flats. And it was kind of like a disaster as far as I know. It just created this huge, silty mess of like mud. I'm not sure how well it worked. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's, I was thinking more along the lines of, has anybody talked to the residents? I mean, is it something that's part of the discussion, or is it way too early for that to happen?
We have not engaged the community about this idea yet because it's really so far away from any sort of implementation. We really need to understand the environmental impacts, and really the model is what's going to help us with that. The sediment, all the stuff that's going on with the small scale experiments are going to inform that. Without that, we're not going to know what's going to happen. So yeah, it's going to be something that would require a lot of engagement. And it's not going to be inexpensive. I mean, to do that kind of engineering design, that's beyond my expertise. The engineers in here would know better how to do that.
I'd like to follow up on Brian's question. So a lot of this work, as Tom said, came from the Netherlands. And so some of you may know they did this really big project called the Sand Engine, where rather than doing annual or biannual beach nourishments, they said, we're going to really massively nourish. And what they found is that they ended up significantly enhancing the ecosystem. They added a kilometer of beach into the ocean, a kilometer of beach, and then they waited for it to distribute. So they basically said, okay, well, this actually turns out it's worked out really well for our local ecosystem as far as birds and plants and critters and cooties and all the kinds of things they want, not to mention it's protecting, and they are like the champions of engineered solutions, right? Because they have to be. And so they then said, well, can we use this sort of natural, we'll call it engineering with nature approach in other places? So that's where they came up with this mud motor idea. Didn't go so well. And we know that Hampton Seabrook is significantly threatening bird species. We are having there's significant influence as far as carbon, coastal resiliency, floodings of homes. So the loss of marsh, and 70% of the tax base is on that spit of Hampton Seabrook Estuary. 70%, and that's for 3 towns. So they're looking at some pretty substantial changes if they do nothing. I don't think anybody's promoting that we do this, but the question is that in order to even think about doing something, you have to be able to understand the basic.
Oh, yeah. No,
Yeah.
no, we disagree on that.
Yeah,
On that, there's no problem with that. It is the potential for unintended consequences and things of this nature are enormous.
Is enormous.
And so it's something, the question was going through my head was, what's the relative risk balance here? And from what you're telling me, it sounds very much like we might be less risk adverse in this situation than we might be elsewhere, because if we do nothing.
If we do nothing, yeah.
We're wrong for us anyway.
We're losing low marsh at an unprecedented rate, and high marsh is turning into low marsh, which then affects all the species that depend on it. And then it's going to affect flooding and when you have increased storms. So, Tom and team are really focused on listen, could we even do simulations that would be useful?
Mhm.
And it's a good point about the low marsh too. Maybe we can do something with the low marsh with not so fine grained material, which would be better. There's a lot more sand out there. Maybe that's going to be useful enough. Maybe we can do the low marsh that will protect the high marsh and not worry about the high marsh. So it's an interesting point about the Netherlands too. I mean, when they do nourishment projects and things like that, they come and look at our projects and they laugh. I mean, the scales of them are like, I don't know.